Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community.
Far more powerful than all the others.
And now, here's your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plough.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the PowerShell Podcast. I'm Ultra Superstar Jordan, along with even bigger Ultra Superstar Andrew.
So kind of you.
Well, last week I was a bit harsh, so it's trying to bring it back around full circle.
Well, thank you so much, Jordan. Very kind of you.
I often wonder if people listen to the intro and decide if are these days that I'm angry at you or not, based on how friendly I get.
You're friendly now, so I guess you had a good lunch.
It was delicious. Thank you for asking.
Good.
So what do we got going on?
So there's been some cool articles that have come out recently. There is awesome one by Patrick, PowerShell Search and Delete Empty Folders. I think that's a very useful thing for a lot of people, and especially if you're newer to PowerShell, that type of project can be pretty approachable. We also have our friend, MDGRS, and I need to message him and find out how to actually pronounce it, but MDGRS dropping an awesome blog about PowerShell classes and the session state.
We need a pronunciation guide.
Yeah, I think James had an idea of how to pronounce it, but I'm not sure it was accurate.
I don't know. He was very confident. But speaking of James, we also have a new user group coming up, the Pacific PowerShell user group. The first ever meeting is September 13th at 6 p.m. Pacific time. So if you want to learn kind of an intro into modules, that's a great one to attend, and we're hoping to get a nice combination of advanced and beginner topics for everyone.
Awesome. So beginners are welcome to
Absolutely. You got to start encouraged.
Oh my gosh. And we often talk about getting involved in groups and finding people and maybe asking questions and things like that. And user groups are a great way to do that. And having more user groups is awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited for having a new one in my region. You're on the other side.
Well, the internet brings us all together. I believe it'll be an online meeting. So, hey, you might see me there. Don't count me out.
I like it. Enough of us. No,
I got to share one more awesome blog.
I apologize.
Friend of the podcast, Harm Veenstra, dropped an awesome blog about retrieving local and remote PowerShell logs. There's many reasons why that would be helpful.
I have no desire to see how many times I've typed my password in clear text.
Oh, no, you would never, Jordan.
It's not zero. So,
yeah, password in plain text, please no. There's a good project from Microsoft to help you with those secrets.
All right, but no one's here to listen to us. We're great and all, but we have special guest today, OG PowerShell legend, Bruce Payette. I didn't even check. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Bruce.
Close enough.
Close enough? Okay.
That's our history, is usually close enough with the pronunciations.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. This has been, I'm excited about this one. We love talking to people that were there from day one. It's always interesting to hear their take on where we're at versus where it started.
Yeah, it's come a long way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like whenever I got into PowerShell around V3, V4, it was so new that everyone was still the same people. Your active memory could kind of hold a lot of what happened, but now it's been over a decade. Things have changed so much. It's kind of cool to go back and see some of the founding PowerShell team members who helped create what we all enjoy today, and it has grown a lot since then.
Mm-hmm.
So to touch on that, how was the vibes in the early PowerShell days? What was the smell in the air of the team? And I believe it was a pretty small team back in the day as well.
It was a very small team. It was sort of interesting because the team that was doing it was supposed to be staffed out of the India Development Center. We ended up moving it back to Redmond because we couldn't get enough qualified developers, experienced developers in India at the time. I'm sure that's not a problem now. But it was a very small team, Jim Tour, myself, and not Jeffrey at that point. So the original Shell project, Jeffrey was in a different group, but the manager who was running the Shell project said, he's got this really cool idea, come and take a look. And so we wandered over to his office, and he demonstrated the idea behind PowerShell, the reflective pipelines. And we agreed that was something we really wanted to take on. So it's pretty exciting. It was a whole new approach to writing a shell, a very different model. So that was very exciting. At the time, Microsoft was very competitive driven, if you will. I know there's XKCD did a set of org charts for different companies, and the one for Microsoft was a whole bunch of triangles pointing guns at each other, which was kind of similar. Jeffrey described it as being like a cockroach in a country bar. Everybody's trying to crush you. So.
Well, I didn't realize it was quite that hostile. I'm glad you guys were able to find your niche in there, though.
Yeah. Jeffrey was very good at managing up, I guess. So.
One thing that I really enjoy about the PowerShell community is how we're kind of like growth mindset, open to different opinions, constructive, and it sounds kind of like internally at Microsoft at the time, it wasn't so much like that. Do you know where that comes from in the PowerShell community? Because I know there was also the DevOps movement, which kind of influenced things a bit, but where does that come from in the PowerShell world?
Well, the people working on PowerShell, Jim and I both came from a Unix background. So we were more familiar with that sort of culture. And I mean, one of our original goals was that PowerShell should be open source. That didn't fly with the execs at the time, but the company has evolved, and so we were finally able to go open source.
Exciting.
Go ahead.
So it kind of makes sense that it would eventually become open source if in the early days there were those thoughts, but it's super impressive for that to actually be a thing. And I think in the history of Microsoft, it's a pretty impactful achievement and very interesting signal to be sending from a company for them to go from being very competitive driven to now like, wow, we're doing something open source and putting it out there for everyone.
Yeah,
how is that for you to reflect on?
It's great. I mean, it's the environment is much better, I think, for people now. Much more cooperation, much more enthusiasm about the community. Back in the old days, there was a certain attitude towards customers that they were just kind of annoying, and that we were always right. And it took a while, it took a long time before we started really appreciating the customers. PowerShell team was customer focused right from the beginning. We did it really early betas and so forth. So we were kind of an outlier at the time, but it's now much more normal.
What are some of the key design principles that you think help made PowerShell a success and resonate with people?
We tried to leverage existing stuff wherever we could. So PowerShell adds the novelty of the pipeline, object pipeline, but we tried to adapt stuff from different existing programming languages that work really well. Most of the grammar in the language is C#, the for each statement and all that. We started off looking at Perl, but we decided that would be too strange. So we went with C#, with the idea that the shell should appeal to developers as well. So the other thing that was funny is that all the language groups were under the developer division, except for the Visual Basic Scripting host, which was still owned by the developer division, but it was focused on admins. With PowerShell coming along, we were the first language product to not be part of DevDiv. So we did a ton of reviews with them, but we're the only language that shipped from Microsoft that wasn't out of the developer division.
And how did you get feedback from customers, and how did you kind of facilitate that interaction?
Well, we did early closed betas. One of the things that really helped actually is we were working with the Exchange team. The Exchange team, people were complaining that you couldn't automate Exchange. So they were looking for a way to do that, and we had a shell. So it was a nice synergy there. And so we got feedback from our customers, like people through our beta. We got feedback from the Exchange team and from their beta customers. So we tried to get as much user feedback as possible, as soon as possible.
Yeah, that is pretty helpful to see. I think nowadays it's a little easier for that type of feedback to be shared compared to back then with like the internet and GitHub and that whole thing. But that is quite interesting. Are there any features in PowerShell that you're particularly proud of? Maybe took a lot of kind of tweaking or were kind of a passion project for you?
Well, I'm proud of script blocks coming in. They came in because we needed a way to group statements. One of the other team wanted to use them. And so we needed to have a grouping mechanism, and it was logical to put in, well, what in most languages are called lambdas, done as script blocks. And this idea of first-class functions, first-class code as data sort of thing is considered a big idea in programming languages. But it's something that we were able to introduce into PowerShell, and it was almost seamless. People got it right away. And it made a whole bunch of scenarios possible that wouldn't have been otherwise, like graphical programming with Windows Forms or WPF, and just in general interoperating with the .NET platform.
Okay, so you mentioned WPF forms. So that the script blocks would allow you to, like, whenever you click on a certain button or something, it would execute some kind of script block. Is that kind of the function of them in that context?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a way of binding actions to controls in a graphical environment.
Right.
And that was something I was playing around with it, and it required one relatively small change to enable it. And so we took this change to our management, because at this point we were starting to lock down. It was getting ready to do a release. And we said, look, there's this tiny change that's like 1 or 2 lines of code, but it enables a whole universe of stuff. And the management team said, no, you can't do that, because it introduces too many scenarios that we haven't tested. And we tested the code, but it just opened up a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't in the original plan, so to speak. But with Jeffrey's assistance and a lot of pushing, that change did go in, and allowing people to write Windows Forms apps in PowerShell.
Wow. That seems like a pretty huge accomplishment right there, to be able to get that done, or at least some form of a turning point in the history of PowerShell. Maybe it would have been done later, but that is quite interesting.
Yeah. Other feature would be, I guess, modules. Modules came in sort of halfway through V2. We were doing some other stuff for enabling exchange of scenarios, which led us to expose the session state object. And once we had the session state object available, then we could wrap that in modules, basically. And we wanted modules to work for every circumstance. So one of the program managers sat down with Visio and drew this picture. And it was arrows and lines and boxes and bubbles and all the way you could do things with modules. Incredibly flexible. I don't think half the features get used, but it was a challenge getting it in, getting it tested, and getting it shipped. So I'm pretty proud of that.
I'm glad I'm tasked with writing a blog about my favorite modules, and I am struggling just because they're so prevalent. There's so many great things. So I'm glad it's in there, because I think that's a massive impact of allowing, like, if you ever thought to yourself, I wish PowerShell could do this, you're not the first person to think it, and someone's probably done it. That's a nice addition.
Yeah. We followed, I think Perl was the first one to really do generalized archive modules. They had CPAN, the Comprehensive Perl Archive Network. And so if you wanted to do something with Perl, you would go and get a module for it. We really wanted to have that in PowerShell right from the beginning. That was one of our goals. It took 2 releases to get there. We got the modules in version 2, and then the gallery came later for a bunch of complicated management reasons.
It sounds like those 2 features that you mentioned are kind of things that take PowerShell from just a tool to solve specific problems to a tool to solve any problem.
Right. Yeah, that's where we were trying to go with it. We wanted to enable all the scenarios. We want it to be a good tool for IT pros, definitely, but it should also be a tool that appeals to developers. In Unix land, developers write shell scripts. They do a lot of scripting, and we wanted to enable that on Windows in a much easier way. Like you could, it was kind of a funny thing. So there was I forgot what the thing was called, but there was a collection of how-tos for Visual Basic. And so we thought, well, we better adapt that for PowerShell because it's appealing to our IT pros. And by the time we had adapted so every Visual Basic script began with 6 or 8 lines of setting stuff up for COM, and then 1 or 2 lines of actually doing anything. Since we didn't need to set up anything special for COM, most of their examples trimmed down to like 1-liners. So it wasn't even really worth it. It's just an example.
So every script can be a 1-liner if you're dedicated enough.
Well, I used to joke that the average length of a PowerShell script is one line.
They really can often be. So many can. It's like probably more readable to separate them into a few lines, but I feel like there's so much you can do. And frankly, once you get comfortable, so much fun can be had in the pipeline and with a lot of the tools that are there for you to run script blocks and do things and manipulate objects and iterate through them and translate them. And it's just such a good time. It's one of my favorite things about being decent at PowerShell is being able to creatively write PowerShell, just like in the pipeline.
Right. That was our goal.
It's funny you mentioned that because I actually have a signed copy of your book. Signed by you. And Richard Sidaway. And you said, have fun with PowerShell is what you signed it. So
that's great. Yeah.
Definitely had a lot of fun with PowerShell. And I think a lot of our listeners have as well.
It's hard not to. So with PowerShell in action, did the idea come from that? Like, we built this great thing, but we want an easier and on-ramp for everyone? Or I guess what brought about the idea for your book?
Well, I was answering a lot of questions online, and the acquisitions editor at Manning, the publisher, decided to approach me to see if I would be willing to write a book. And I said, sure, not realizing how hard it was to write a book. So, what I wanted to do with that book, though, was try and capture as much of the thinking that went into PowerShell, why things are the way they are, as much as what they do.
So kind of give the context behind things, because things tend to make more sense, right? Because I think you mentioned a lot of things in PowerShell are borrowed from the best parts of other languages. And kind of understanding that can explain a lot of the patterns, and it all can kind of click.
Yeah.
So I have an interesting question here. So some people call PowerShell a scripting language. Some call it an automation framework. I think that's the language Microsoft uses these days. Or some people call it a programming language. What is PowerShell?
All of the above. So it's interesting because there were actually 2 parts to PowerShell conceptually when we started. One was the pipeline engine, and that's still available through the PowerShell API. And then there was the language that would consume the engine. And we had this idea that people could take the engine and wrap new languages around it and provide different experiences. And that's still largely the case. That's what I do with Braid. So,
well, that sounds like a great entry to the the next topic. So Braid is your current project. I saw out on X, Doug Fink did the first Hello World, or I don't know if it's just a screenshot of yours, but it sounds like it's a new language you've been working on for a while.
Yep, it's built on top of PowerShell. It uses PowerShell as a framework, but it's an entirely new. Well, it's a very different language than PowerShell. I wanted to explore some new ideas, and I wanted to have a framework to try those ideas out. One of the things that's with PowerShell is the last few years we haven't seen much happening with the language. I think the last language change was the ternary operator that Dongbo put in. But pretty much after classes, we didn't do much with the language. And in the meantime, there's so much other stuff happening with languages, new ideas. A lot of functional programming stuff has come in. And so I wanted to explore some of those in the context of PowerShell and in a shell as well. So,
what is functional programming, and how is that different than PowerShell?
So PowerShell is, you can argue that PowerShell is a functional programming language because you combine a set of commands together to do processing of objects, translating, transforming, and emitting objects. And that's what you do with functional programming. Functional programming comes from mathematics. And so there's a couple of things that are not true in PowerShell that are true for functional languages, like no mutation. You always end up creating new data structures. So if I want to add something to a list, I have to make a copy of the list and add one thing. In fact, that's how PowerShell works, sort of by accident. It's not terribly efficient, so you have to do a lot of careful stuff under the covers to make that work. But yes, and there's also what's called the algebraic type system, which is probably too obscure to go into. The idea of having there's a ton of type theory, which is based on sets, and they talk about having product types and sum types and higher kinded types and all that sort of stuff. So that's probably more than anybody wants to know.
Do you know what dynamic polymorphism is?
Polymorphism at runtime. So
okay. We heard that word in our interview with James Brundage, and I'm just curious if it's a term that you've heard before. So we know what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
We've learned things.
We have, and it's pretty cool. Now, so Braid would you consider it its own programming language?
It's its own programming language the same way PowerShell is. It just incorporates, you can call PowerShell seamlessly from it. So,
okay. But there's a fresh syntax to it, so it's not
there's
it's not commandlets. Yeah.
So the core idea of a shell is a command with arguments. And if you need to call another command, then you put that in parentheses and call another command, and so on and so forth. So it's lists of commands and arguments in lists. And there is the second oldest programming language out there is called Lisp, and that's basically its structure, lists of commands and arguments. And so that's where I went with sort of the core syntax. Maybe trying to show some of it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So since we do primarily our listeners are audio listeners, so we'll sort of describe what we're seeing on screen here.
Oh, this should be interesting. Yes.
I mean, some of it'll be syntax specific because it is different than PowerShell syntax. It has that. I see that you define variables, I think, by using let. So different ways of doing things. But I think if you're familiar with certain other languages, it'll probably snap into your head in a certain place.
Yeah.
Maybe.
It's much more programmer centric than admin centric. So one of the things that we did with PowerShell is we wanted to make it super productive for people to use. And so there's a lot of work going on in the PowerShell engine that does type conversions and just tries to give you the right answer for anything you type. So in some ways, it's almost a user interface as much as it is a programming language. So just a slight aside, are you familiar with the TIOBE programming language index?
No, what's that?
It's a testing company that publishes this popularity chart of languages. And PowerShell never gets very high on that chart because the queries that they use are, they look for the word programming and then the name of the language. So programming Python, programming Perl. But most people describe PowerShell as scripting. So if you take their query and put in scripting instead of PowerShell, or instead of programming, suddenly the hit count goes way, way up. So it annoys me.
Mm. So we should be better represented on that list. Dang it, Tayobi.
Yeah, I think so. I think that.
Well, I think there's 1 billion monthly sessions at this point. It feels like it's pretty, should be up there.
Sessions, not total sessions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're sharing the screen.
And for those listening, if you switch to YouTube about 25 minutes in, you can find the switch to share screen.
I'm trying to find the right thing. I think that's it.
Yeah.
So let's start Braid.
Okay, so you run start Braid to initialize Braid.
Yeah, so it loads. So Braid is written in C#, and Braid and PowerShell. And so the actual read evaluate print loop is PowerShell, and it calls into the Braid DLLs to do the work. When if you clone my GitHub repo, you'll see that it's set up with an examples directory, tests and staging, tools at the top level to do basically start Braid and to build Braid, and it copies everything into a staging directory that you can run out of. Right now, the build only works on Windows PowerShell 5. It's the only one that does the build, but the DLL that's produced will run anywhere. I run it on Mac OS. It runs on Linux. The same DLL works everywhere because it's a pure IL DLL. So let's go into the examples directory.
And we'll have a link to this GitHub so you can get cloned on your machine and run through these and play with Braid.
Yeah. So the default experience in Braid kind of sucks because if you run help, it gives you lots and lots and lots of characters on the screen and nothing to really browse it. So I'm going to try and fix that very soon. A better way of getting documentation, use doc command. So a lot of the syntax in Braid, it is a Lisp, but it's modeled on a language called Clojure, which is a JVM language. And it introduced a bunch of stuff, a bunch of additional syntax, because pure Lisp is nothing but parens. Clojure introduced some additional stuff, so you can have like a list of a vector of numbers, dictionaries.
So looking at kind of the doc you pulled up there while you're showing that example, for the, if I understand, the if condition is basically you have the if condition and then you don't need to specify the else. If you just put a second segment, it will assume it's an else, or am I reading that wrong? Okay.
That's right. Yeah, that's another thing about this sort of class of language is that there are no statements, there are no operators. Everything is done with functions. So in a lot of ways, the syntax is actually considerably simpler than PowerShell, but it requires getting your head around it. Some basic stuff just works. So I type, actually I should say, file item. If I look at the definition for ls, it's just the command info object for get child item. So you can call any PowerShell commandlets or functions or even external programs.
Does the pipeline work?
Pipeline works. It works in kind of a strange way.
So you're doing a ipconfig pipeline to a for each?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, for each object. There we go.
Yeah, for each object. And then pass in script block.
Is create script block a built-in PowerShell command, or did you create it with Braid? I don't know if I've ever used it.
Braid specific command.
Okay.
Which allows you to have embedded chunks of code. and you can use it in turn to call add type. So you can use C# code embedded as well. Actually, that's a fun demo. Lee Holmes wrote this a couple of years ago as a demo for PowerShell, and I adapted it because I think it's kind of cool.
And that was
nice.
burn console flames.
Yeah, the flames. Yes.
Awesome.
So
It's way better than CLS.
So you're a Vim user. We're looking at the burn console script.
Yeah. See here that script uses add type to add a bunch of C# stuff to make it fast.
Mm.
And interestingly, I'm running this on the console host. If you run it on the new Microsoft terminal, it's very slow. The terminal is just not as fast as the console, and it's nowhere close to being as fast as a Unix terminal, which is sort of too bad.
Would you consider this a performant language?
It performs better than PowerShell, but I haven't put a lot of effort into making it really fast. I mean, Fibonacci sequence, so we'll calculate the 25th. So at first, so Fibonacci sequence is any given number in the sequence is the sum of the previous two numbers in the sequence. And so the first two, 0 and 1, are 1. So the next one after that will be 2, and then 3, and then 5, and so forth. And that's what this does. It says if the argument is 0, then return 1. If the argument is 1, return 1. Otherwise, it's a number, and and this is where the math gets a little weird, because what our operators in PowerShell are functions here. So plus is a function, minus is a function. So this is saying call PowerShell or call fib on the previous element in the sequence.
Right.
And
so to get that information, you did echo and then fib for Fibonacci. So is that kind of like equivalent to like get command, where it gives you some details, or how's that function?
One of the things that Braid does is it puts all of the bound symbols into one namespace. So in PowerShell, you have the functions are in one namespace, variables are in a separate namespace, commandlets are in a separate namespace. So you have to use prefixes to be able to use one in a different space. I don't know if that makes any sense. But in Braid, they're all in one namespace. And so all I'm doing is I'm echoing the value of the fib command. And it shows you what his code is.
Okay.
Echo the PowerShell version of that command.
Yeah, definition. Oh.
Right the third time. Yeah, so it gives you a function, and then this gives you the code of for the PowerShell Fibonacci function.
Would that work if you also did like dot definition? I'm just curious. Like, does it have all the properties? You just access it by putting a dot and then the property name?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, cool.
That gives you definition. So let's run these things. Run the Braid one first. It takes about a second. Run the PowerShell one. Maybe
taking a little bit longer on that one.
Yeah, it's taking a little bit longer. Yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah, so 8 times slower. So yeah, it's faster than PowerShell is in a lot of things. So the range command is the equivalent of the double dot operation in in PowerShell. So I'm just going to generate a range of numbers, 10,000 numbers.
What's the double dot function? I don't know if I thought dot was like a directory.
If you do 1.2 or 1.
Okay, yeah, I totally know that. A.z, yeah, got it. I have used that a lot then.
So I'm watching type out this command, and so you start off with range 10,000, then you pipe that, but then you did for each object, which is PowerShell, because you said it was built on PowerShell, and then you pipe that into void. So it's like a combination of use Braid, but where needed, it seamlessly goes into PowerShell. Yeah,
because PowerShell has so much functionality from all of the modules. And this is what I meant by integrating the language, integrating the PowerShell core pipeline component into Braid in a seamless way. So you can pass stuff from Braid commands into PowerShell commands, and PowerShell commands back into Braid commands. You can call PowerShell functions or commandlets or scripts. It's all available, plus the stuff that Braid brings as well.
So what would be a use case where this would be a great fit for them and helps their need?
If they want a little bit more performance, if they want, it's more of a programming language. Let me quickly do this demo and then I'll show exactly what I meant.
Okay.
So, and now I'm going to use the equivalent map because it comes from mathematics. So it's basically the same thing. It just takes the ID function, which just passes its argument. And you can see that, again, 80 times faster. So it's significantly faster doing pipeline operations. I think that there should be some effort expended on improving the performance of the pipeline with PowerShell. When we introduced the DLR, the component, the compiling component into PowerShell, the PowerShell language got 10 times faster, but every time you have to call a command, it just slows you right down. So now I was talking about programming. So in PowerShell, if you declare, here's how you declare a function. And I'm going to constrain the type of this function.
So I'm watching type this one out and trying to follow along. So for me, I struggle to read Braid as it is. Is it something where Braid is just as readable? I just have to get used to the new syntax, or is it something where you're giving up readability for ease of function?
You have to become used to the syntax. It's not as easy to get into as PowerShell. If you're familiar with a Lisp language, like Doug had done some Clojure, he was able to use it fairly easily. It takes its root from a different family of languages. So here's my foo function. Define foo, takes a single argument that's of type int and then returns it. So works fine on numbers. It fails because it's a string, it's not a number. Right, so in PowerShell, it would have automatically converted it, whether you wanted it to or not. And in Braid, you have much more control over what you're doing. So if I want it to be converted, then I stick a question mark in front of it that says, this is a soft type, try and convert to this type, rather than requiring that the type is exactly what you said. So now it'll work.
And so for the listeners, basically you build a function for an integer, then you put quotes around it to make it a string, and it failed because it was looking for an integer.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
But then you're able to still tap into PowerShell's helpfulness, where it tries to convert things for you by just adding a question mark at the end.
Yeah, and that's what one of the things I tried to do with Braid was to make it more strict. I mean, in PowerShell, you can set strict mode and cause a bunch of things to be checked at runtime or compile time. Well, runtime, I guess. But Braid is even stricter, and it allows you to turn these sort of knobs on and off at different spots. So when you set strict mode in PowerShell, it actually sets it for the entire environment, and everything has to follow it. Which means that if you're using a module that has some strict mode violations, then it could fail if you turn strict mode on and you're in the script that consumes the module. With Braid, you have a lot more choice about how you can, where you can choose to be flexible in your constraints and where you want to be rigid.
I've heard the complaint about PowerShell regarding its performance, regarding the kind of way that sometimes it makes calls for you, like to convert types, and there's other helpful things that are helpful for a language that make it easy to pick up, but it's definitely a downside for certain applications. And it seems like this is kind of what Braid helps solve, is you have that performance benefit, you have a lot of the statically typed benefits, but also you're able to tap into, let's say you have a background in PowerShell, your favorite modules that perform great things that you don't have to now rewrite. You can make use of other scripts maybe you've written in the past if your environment has some PowerShell. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's the idea, that all of the breadth of coverage that PowerShell provides is wrapped in a language that's more programmer focused than necessarily admin focused. It's more focused on creating larger artifacts, larger scripts, where more rigidity is a good thing.
So for a scripting-minded person who's only written a couple PS1s that kind of do small things, what would be an example of an application that would be better suited for using something like Braid?
As an example, editor. It's not huge, but it's a full screen editor that and
So you've been doing some typing here, but you've lost me a little bit. So you're trying text edit, which was throwing up an error. So you did gvim into...
Yeah, I'm using another editor to look at my editor.
Okay.
So I'm starting a new Braid session.
Use by another process. Okay.
Yeah. So let me kill the other process first.
Well,
actually,
while you get working on that, so Jordan, I would say definitely if you're listening to this, this is a more advanced type feature. If you're new to PowerShell and just working on getting your commands, don't worry. You don't have to be able to read this. This is another one of those cool things about PowerShell, where there are amazing modules and projects, and there are upper bounds of what you can do. But that doesn't mean that you have to shoot for the moon from day one. You can still work on building your skills slowly, implementing your scripts, implementing automation. And as time goes on, our skills get better, our use cases change, our responsibilities change, and we can learn new things.
Right. And that's sort of the same model that .NET uses. So you have the .NET framework that has tons of useful classes, but then you can use those classes from C# or Visual Basic or F# or any one of a number of languages. So here, PowerShell becomes that repository of functionality, and this is just a slightly higher level way of utilizing it.
Yeah, I remember hearing a few years ago about some people, some contributors from PowerShell, community contributors who were kind of considering some form of another shell that maybe implements some of the language improvements or things that they'd like to see done or whatever. And this seems like that's kind of what this is. It is a way to extend what PowerShell does and make different choices fundamentally about how you approach things.
Mhm.
And it's so interesting to me that it's compatible with PowerShell and you make advantage of it, but it is a C# project technically.
Yeah, it's mostly written in C#. But it's just a library that anybody can call.
And what does TL stand for? So the extension on these files is
That's
.tl.
a funny thing. When I first started working on it, it was called Tiny Lisp because it was small. Then I changed the name, but I didn't change the extension. I really should do that someday. So this is a text editor that I wrote in Braid.
I don't think we can see this window.
Pardon?
I don't think we can see the text editor window.
Yeah, that's really annoying. Yeah, can I switch windows? This thing happened on Doug's podcast as well. Wait, you're seeing GVim though, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was airing out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's annoying.
It's rather impressive, for everyone out there. Oh, hey, here we go. We're in Vim now.
Yeah, but we're in Vim in the console.
Right.
And so this is a little over 1,000 lines of code, not including the modules, the WinForms module and the console module.
And you went back to calling your script blocks to lambdas, as you mentioned, was what they're initially called.
Yeah. So they are called lambdas now in Braid. That's actually a tricky thing. PowerShell is very opinionated in how things should be named, but then so are Lisp languages. And so finding the right balance between Lisp terminology, which can be deeply obscure, and PowerShell terminology is a challenge. Yeah, so this is the code of the editor. I'm just trying to put in a whole bunch of functions.
Yeah, Jordan, he's a programmer.
Yeah, it's
holy smokes.
When you were starting off easy, I think I was following pretty well, but man, this gets
yeah, this is where the more programmer friendly part of it is.
So where this is more programmer friendly, I guess where sometimes you have those that script on Windows side versus the program side where there's a little bit of conflict. Would this be a good bridge for that, where it'd be something where they both can read and understand what's going on, or is it always just going to be kind of that disconnect?
It makes it possible for people to share artifacts through the common interfaces defined by PowerShell. You can create an artifact in whatever language you want and then share it through a module. I don't actually have that working yet, but it's going to work. You can call PowerShell from Braid, but you can't call Braid from PowerShell exactly. It's clunky.
Because you'd have to initialize it and enter it.
Yeah, I can.
So you're calling shell PS version table.
Yeah, so that just calls out to a piece of PowerShell code. And you can dynamically type code in here. And we'll produce a spew, and you can take the output and.
Oh, nice. Take 10.
Yeah, that's you can sort of do that in PowerShell with select dash first. But this pattern of functions, there's a whole bunch of functions, map and filter and take and drop, that are all kind of an algebra of lists, and they're not all there in PowerShell. So there's a function called reduce, and so we have 100 integers. Reduce them. So what reduce does is it iterates through the collection, applying the function to each member of the collection and its previous member all the way along. So what this will do is it'll sum up that range. And you can also do it with multiply. So it's basically the Fibonacci, or not a factorial. Factorial 100. And you can go here.
So basically what this did is you took the range of, so you took every number between 1 and 100, and then the first one you added them all together, and the second one you multiplied them all together.
Yeah, yes. Exactly.
Okay.
So, one more.
Getting some big numbers there.
Big numbers, yes,
I filled your screen.
I got to tell my son, man, algebra, you better be focusing, man.
I regret, my background is as an engineer, and I regret not having as much algebra as I wanted.
So the naming is a bit unique, at least to me on that one. So reduce to me would be making the smallest version, but in this case, since you added the plus sign, it was adding each number together. So it's definitely a learning curve.
Because it tends to come from mathematics. It has very specific mathy terms. The other term for reduce is called fold. So if you think of it as you have a piece of paper that has numbers written on it, and then as you apply each fold, you just fold the paper over and fold the paper over and fold the paper over until the end you end up with one pile of numbers. That I think is a way to other tricks you can do. I'm going to generate 1,000 random numbers, but I want to find the biggest one. Use the built-in, but I can also use reduce and max to do that. That's the biggest number that was in that list of random numbers, because it takes each number and compares it to the previous number. And if the new number is bigger, then it passes it on to the next iteration. So you can sort out lists like that.
And so in that case, 998 feels low. Out of 1,000 random numbers, you think that at some point you get into the millions or billions, but
no, it's the other thing that random does by default is if you ask for a set of numbers of a particular size, it makes sure that all those numbers are within that range. So it generates random numbers from 1 to 1,000.
Oh, okay.
Could you increase that? Just a second argument, I guess. Oh, there you go.
I want to do bigger numbers, for example. Actually, you might look up my documentation sometimes.
Got to check the docs. Always a good idea.
Yes.
So doc almost feels like get help.
Yeah, doc is like get help.
Okay.
Get the documentation for this command. I want actually random.
So that should quickly be viewed as one of the core commands.
Yeah, it should probably be called help by default.
But then it could kind of conflict with PowerShell, but maybe not.
Yeah, because actually the help command does conflict with PowerShell.
So it looks like if you provide 2 arguments, it should do it.
Yeah. 100 and 1 and million.
Okay, so underscores in place of commas.
Yeah.
Okay.
The maximum number. That gives me the minimum. Whoop. Typo.
Oh, reduce min, so you could grab the smallest.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So those looking at, so you took you wanted random 100 numbers between 1 and 1 million, and you took both the largest and the smallest number that it pulled from those 100.
That's right.
Okay. And it ran fast. Like that's.
Yeah.
It's pretty fast.
Not to put you under the pressure here, but how long would that take to write in PowerShell? Because I feel like I've done coding interviews in the past where I've had to do similar things to this in PowerShell.
Well, PowerShell has a built-in sort, so you can do it that way. It wouldn't take much longer, I don't think, to do that. I have another sort, so let's call sort functions.
So 100,000 random numbers between 1 and a million.
Oh, so you're doing, and now you're using the sort object instead. Okay.
Cool.
That's numbers. Yeah, so that took 2.5 seconds to run. If it take too long, I'll knock off one digit. So yeah, no sort object.
And is void kind of like out null?
Yeah. So QSort is written in Braid. Sort object is written in C sharp, but it's still the times are not all that significant. Like it's 10-ish times faster to use C sharp versus Braid, for example, in this particular scenario. Now I'll just use the built-in sort.
So
it's like a fraction of a millisecond, actually. So that the built-in sort uses link to do the sorting, and it's pretty fast.
Nice.
Right. And so you mentioned that Doug picked this up pretty quick because he already did a language that used the Lisp.
Yeah, Lisp language.
Okay.
Yeah, he was familiar with Clojure, which is where I took a bunch of syntax from.
All right. So if you don't have any sort of background with, I mean, obviously I didn't even know the name of that. What would be the best way to learn that syntax? Would it just be to dive into Braid, or is there a different way to go about learning that?
Diving into Braid would be once I make the environment a little more friendly and have help and stuff. You could do that because you still have all the PowerShell stuff underlying. And the syntax itself is not a lot to that, because it's just again lists of commands and arguments. So just playing around with it, getting a sense. The trickiest bit is to remember the non-infix notation. So it's that instead of 2 plus 2. I actually have a macro. That lets you write it that way. And you can see so macros in Lisp are one of the most powerful features of Lisp. They're functions written in Braid that are executed by the compiler when it's compiling the language. So this particular one, because Braid uses a prefix notation for numeric operators, so what this did is it took 3 plus 2 and then turned it into plus 3 and 2. And that was done once at compile time, so there's no runtime performance implications. In this operator, it generates the correct nested set of function calls.
So this will be how you solve those Facebook arguments we see all the time of what's the answer of this. It's like, well,
yeah. Yes. You're a genius, so you can add 2 plus 2.
Order of operations is done for you.
Yeah.
That's a nice addition.
Yeah. So the macros, in fact, there's no for I equals 1, I is less than 100, I plus plus. That type of C sharp or C for statement is done as a macro in Braid. And
just for my brain, coming full circle, Lambda, I think that's also an AWS little thing that runs bits of code for you too. So it's in my mind.
They're like the equivalent of Azure functions.
Right.
But an abstract name for a function is a Lambda. And that's why they called it Lambda.
It makes sense when you have the context, right? It kind of seems like everything builds on each other in a sort of way. Okay, so this is the for statement in Braid syntax.
Yeah, but what it actually is, is it's a macro that runs the compile time and it turns it into a while loop instead of having a unique loop. So you can build new things out of at runtime, or at compile time rather. You can extend the language.
And we mentioned that PowerShell sometimes has performance issues or whatever. How are you able to build Braid in a way that goes around that? Is it just because it's calling its own engine?
Yeah, it's calling its own interpreter rather than the PowerShell interpreter. The PowerShell interpreter is actually faster, but all of the primitive functions in PowerShell are really slow.
So what's a primitive function?
All the commandlets.
Okay.
Running a commandlet is very slow because it's doing a lot. It has to go look it up. It has to do all the parameter binding, which is an extremely complicated and expensive process. And then it wraps all the output objects in a PS object form. So there's a bunch of overhead that 90% of the time you don't need, but we were trying to aim for 100% of the time. Like every line in get content has the name of the file that the content came from, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that you don't always want that, but sometimes you do. And so our design goal with PowerShell was to get you everything that you could possibly find interesting in 100% of the circumstances, doing it first, doing it up front rather than delaying it. Because eventually when you're using remoting, the overhead of going back and forth a whole bunch of times to get little pieces of information is very, very high, whereas a bulk translation or transfer of information is more efficient. That was our theory. Then the cloud came along.
That did change things up a little bit.
It did, yes. People used to, like, I have this incredibly fast processor, so I can waste CPU cycles on making things look pretty and so on and so forth, until you're in a cloud environment where suddenly it's like the mainframes again and everything is shared. And now you want everything to be as efficient as possible.
Yep, and you're paying for it. So if people want to get involved in Braid or learn more, we'll definitely have a link to the GitHub. Is this a project you're looking for PRs, issues on yet, or where are you with that?
Well, James Brundage has already opened 7 issues on me, all of which are, definitely things I need to fix. Sure, if people are interested. One of the things I would having people to bounce ideas off would be good. Because, as I said, figuring out whether it should be a PowerShell term or a Lisp term, or how should this thing look in this environment. After a while, getting an alternate perspective is very useful. So comments, issues, PRs if you want.
Awesome. I'll check out the show notes for that.
Yes, until I get all the help fixed and a few other things, it's going to be the one of James' issues that he posted was the onboarding experience sucks, and it does. If you're not me, it's difficult to get going with it unless you had familiarity with some of the other languages. I really need to write some getting started documents. I'm actually thinking. There's a website called Learn X and Y Minutes, and they cover a lot of tools and a lot of programming languages, and they're like really good for getting a sense of what a language looks like. And I want to follow the type of pattern that they use for a getting started document.
Cool.
So, all right. Well, I mean, this was something that's far outside my normal expertise. So I've been fascinated to kind of watch your work. I went out of my element pretty quick, but it's starting to coalesce a little bit, but it feels like spending time learning Lisp would be a big first step on diving in fully.
Yeah, at least getting a basic understanding would be necessary. But if I document it right, you should be able to learn it from using Braid. That's the name. That's, by the way, the name of the language Braid is because it brings together all these different ideas from different languages. from Lisp and functional programming languages like Haskell, as well as PowerShell and Ruby and all that sort of thing.
And weave them together.
Yeah, whereas built on top of PowerShell, and the Git help for PowerShell is so prolific. It kind of sets a very high bar for that part within Braid.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that happened because, again, a bit of history. We have all the about topics and all the documentation. That was written primarily by the engineering team initially because they didn't have resources. That we weren't allocated resources to do documentation. So actually, Jim Truer actually wrote most of it in his spare time for the first couple of releases. We did eventually get, we have a documentation team now and tools and processes, but a lot of that getting started documentation was written by the programmers themselves. So it's kind of interesting how well it's turned out.
Awesome.
One more little demo. This is a socket program for querying the time server, the network time protocol. So it tells me what time it is. And it's actually converted from C#, but it lets you do socket programming. Go back to the top. I needed a tool to swap the big endian to little endianness, whether the most significant byte is first or last. I needed to swap that for the default endianness in .NET. I needed a byte array to put stuff in. Here's an example of binary number syntax that I can use to assign to the first byte in that byte array. I call DNS to get the names, the IP address of the name server, the time.windows.com. Set up an IP endport and socket, connect the socket, adding a timeout in case it hangs. And I send the data that I had set up previously. Then I receive the data from the socket, close the socket, and then do a little bit more manipulation, bit manipulation to turn it into a form of time that is understandable by .NET. So this shows an example of, I wouldn't necessarily call it systems programming, but it shows that you can write programs that deal with binary data quite easily in Braid.
And use some .NET stuff too.
Yeah, cool. So, one of the strengths of PowerShell is that it has all of .NET underneath that you can access. Braid has that same advantage, along with all the PowerShell stuff.
Nice. Well, that is very cool. Jordan, do you have some challenging questions? I think we need to hit them with some heavy hitters.
All right, so we have our common parameters. That 3 questions that normally I spin it up as they're going to be difficult, but based on what I've just witnessed, I don't think you're going to struggle here. So first common parameter: what's one time something went wrong on the job, and what did you learn from it?
Checked in the wrong thing, or checked in something I shouldn't have checked in once. It was just a garbage file, but we had to go and get rid of it. And thereafter, I am much more careful about keeping my directories clean. Git helps a lot with that, right? If you have junk in your directory, then Git won't automatically add it. You have to explicitly add it. So
right.
Better tooling is a godsend.
Mm-hmm. And having good processes and code reviews probably makes sure that nothing gets too messy.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You ready for the second common parameter? It only gets more difficult.
Anyway.
With everything you know now, what's one tip you would give your younger self when you're first starting out?
Learn more algebra.
It can be fun. Like I personally, whenever I get into math, I find it pretty fun. But whenever I don't have it in my working memory or used it recently and I'm not into it, it can be challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And computers are mathematical things. So having that understanding, especially of algebra, like all the big learning or AI stuff, generative AI stuff, is all a bunch of applied statistics pretty much. So if you want to understand that stuff deeply, then you need to have that mathematical background.
Oh, I wish we could get into that next, but go ahead, Jordan.
All right, last one. We're going back to pure PowerShell here. What are your 3 favorite modules?
The default modules will all count. Actually, I ran across Pod recently, which is Node for PowerShell, and I find it really intriguing, so I want to play with that a whole bunch.
Yeah, we highlighted that one last episode or 2 episodes ago.
Yeah, it's really neat. What else? What other fun modules? I'm drawing a blank.
PowerShell AI is a big one.
Yeah, PowerShell AI, I've been talking to Doug about that and playing with that, so that's definitely up there.
Awesome. And then the built-in modules, obviously a lot of great stuff there as well.
Yeah.
Shout out Braid, not technically a module, but great way to extend PowerShell.
Well,
All right.
Written in Braid.
All right. Well, I mean, this isn't necessarily new programming language, but I don't know if you're aware of this, but Andrew has perfected the art of shilling a podcast so much that it probably should be its own language. And we're lucky enough to have a front row seat to watch a pure magician just spin his craft. Take it away, Andrew.
I'll get to weaving. Oh, hey, see what I did there? Yes. Thank you so much, listeners. If you're still here with us, you're a friend of the podcast. You're one of us. You're a PowerShell lover. You're part of the community, and we're happy to have you. And in being so happy to have you, we would be even happier if you left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. Tell you what, hey, if you're on YouTube, give us a like, a comment, say what's up. Tell us if you've given Braid a try. Tell us if you learned something new. Do you know what dynamic polymorphism is? Do you? Because I do. You can email us feedback, good or bad, PowerShell@pdq.com. Tell us about you. Tell us about your stories, have any issues, and we can ask them on the air or keep them private. I'm Andrew Plotek. He's DevOps Jordan. And Bruce, people who checked out your project, they're interested in connecting with you, maybe giving some feedback. What's the best way to find you on the World Wide Web?
Bruce Payette on Twitter, on X, or through the GitHub repo.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It was a blast.
Thanks for joining the PowerShell Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plow.
The only device of its kind in the world.
The PowerShell Podcast is a production of PDQ.com.